Good evening. I'm Haylee Ficuciello, Senior Correspondent for Englebrook Independent News. Tonight, we take you across the Midwest United States, where federal prosecutors close out the month of May with major sentencing, indictment, guilty pleas, and law enforcement operations involving pandemic fraud, child exploitation, fentanyl trafficking, firearm offenses, organized crime, public corruption, immigration violation, and large-scale financial fraud. We begin tonight in Minnesota. Federal prosecutors secure one of the most significant fraud sentences of 2026. Amy Bach, founder of Feeding Our Future, was sentenced to 500 months in federal prison for her role in a scheme that diverted approximately $250 million from a federally funded child nutrition program during COVID-19 pandemic. Prosecutors provided that false meal counts, fabricated attendance records, and fraudulent reimbursement claims were used to obtain federal funds intended to feed children. Judge Nancy Brassel described the operation as a fraud vortex and stated Bach stood at the center. The sentence amount to more than 41 years in federal prison. Federal prosecutors also announced a major child exploitation charges against Shadow Hawk Mallon of Austin, Minnesota. Investigators allege Mallon used social media and online platforms to solicit sexually explicit material from minors across the world and threaten victims who refused to continue sending images. Authorities believe hundreds of minors may have been targeted. In another major case, Joseph Andrew Bragg was federally indicted in connection with kidnapping of a child under 10 years old. Investigators tracked Bragg through cell phone location data and rental vehicle records before locating the child alive during a traffic stop. Authorities later discovered additional child sexual abuse material connected to the investigation. In Wisconsin, a Milwaukee man has been sentenced to 16 and a half years in federal prison following a violent robbery spree targeting gas stations throughout Milwaukee and Waukesha County. 22-year-old Jeremiah Tyler admitted to responsibility of 7 completed robberies and 2 attempted robberies. Federal prosecutors say Tyler banished firearms during 6 robberies and discharged a weapon during 1 attempted robbery. Federal prosecutors in Michigan announced a series of significant fraud, firearm, and child exploitation cases. Chance Boy pled guilty to a $4.6 million fraud scheme involving falsely promise of child modeling opportunities. Former corrections employer Arthur Foster pled guilty after admitting to sexually abusing a detainee under his custodial authority. Former medical resident Lincoln Eckerson pled guilty to receiving child sexual abuse material. Former Customs and Border Protection officer Scott Rocky received 6 years sentence after investigators discovered hundreds of child sexual abuse files on his computer. Meanwhile, convicted felon Cartiz Howard received 200 months in prison after prosecutors provided he pointed an AR-style rifle at a victim and later fired multiple rounds in a residential neighborhood. Michigan prosecutors also secured the conviction of Deborah Boudin, who admitted to embezzling nearly $600,000 from her employer. We now move to Iowa. Federal prosecutors secure a 10-year sentence against Raul Mizil Lopez Murata after investigators discovered approximately 117 pounds of methamphetamine hidden inside a vehicle tire. Authorities also announced guilty pleas involving illegal re-entry, methamphetamine distribution conspiracies, repeat narcotic offenders, and financial fraud investigations. Among those cases, Rodriguez Morel Ramos, April Nickel, Matthews Grote, and former loan officer Kylie Jo Bench. Federal courts in Illinois hand down major firearms, narcotic, fraud, and cybercrime prosecutions. Dirk Hugo received a statutory maximum 15-year sentence for illegally possessing a firearm despite multiple prior felony convictions. Federal prosecutors also announced charges against Diego Emanuel Reyes, who is accused of using a vehicle to assault a federal immigration officer during Operation Midway Blitz. Other major cases include cyberstalking Vincent Storm, cartel money carrier Ricardo Tello, firearm offender Gerald Pittman, and narcotic trafficker Rashawn Jones. In Ohio, federal prosecutors charged Oregon resident Nathan Hayes in connection with dozens of bomb threats targeting Ohio schools. Authorities say the threats triggered lockdown and large-scale law enforcement response throughout the state. Federal agents also dismantled a large-scale fentanyl and cocaine trafficking operation in Northeast Ohio. In a separate case, convicted felon Heath Turner received more than 8 years in prison for illegally obtaining firearms throughout a straw purchaser, while gang member Jeffrey Lee received 12 years for racketeering, fentanyl distribution, and firearm offenses connected to the fully blooded felon gang. Still ahead, Kentucky prosecutors pursue civil rights and fraud cases, major organization crime and elder fraud prosecutions in Missouri, and significant federal trafficking sentence in Arkansas. Stay with us. In Kentucky, federal prosecutors announced that former corrections officer Ryan Carhan pled guilty to violating an inmate civil right and submitting false reports regarding the incident. Federal authorities also announced a $2.5 million PPP settlement involving Kentucky Manufacturing Company and capital eligibility federal bank robbery prosecution in Burra. Missouri prosecutors report a wide range of cases involving immigration violations, fraud, organized crime, firearm offenses, and narcotic trafficking. Among the most significant were the immigration cases involving restaurant owner Burke Balgett, the elder fraud conviction of Sid Maki, the school district fraud case involving Ashley Benny, and the organized crime prosecution of former Pagans Motorcycle Club member John Hann. Federal authorities also announced narcotic and firearm sentence involving Darian Gibbons and federal explosive indictment involving Jordan Derrick. Federal prosecutors in Arkansas continue targeting fentanyl trafficking organization and repeat drug offenders. John Lee Underwood received 20 years in prison after admitting to distribute fentanyl that resulted in a fatal death. Douglas Scott Rives received 10 years for fentanyl trafficking. Armed career criminal Davian Adams received 15 years for illegally possessing a firearm, and Orlando Newman received more than 11 years in prison for his role in a multi-state methamphetamine trafficking conspiracy. As of May 2026 comes to a close, federal prosecutors throughout the Midwest continue focusing on several recurring priorities: major fraud investigation involving pandemic-era programs, child exploitation prosecutions, fentanyl trafficking organizations, repeat firearm offenders, organized criminal enterprise, and large-scale public corruption and financial fraud investigations. Federal authorities say these efforts remain among the highest enforcement priorities nationwide. Those are the major federal crime developments across the Midwest United States for the end of May of 2026. As always, we continue monitoring federal indictments, sentencings, major investigations, and significant developments from federal courtrooms throughout the country. For Englebrook Independent News, I'm Haylee Ficuciello. Thank you for joining us tonight. Good night.